Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Cyber Policy Center's seminar. We're at the end of May here, getting close to the end of the academic year and quarter. And I'm delighted that before the year ends, we have Nate Matias here joining us from Cornell. In fact, from the two departments I was in at Cornell back in the day, the Department of Communication and the Department of Information Science. Nate's work really focuses on the human algorithm interaction. One of my favorite papers of last year was his, where he pointed out, look, there's a lot of us interacting with algorithms. We should study them together, and laid out sort of a whole research plan to do that. Now, in addition to inspiring a lot of the work that I do and my students do in the social media lab, Nate is also thinking deeply about how research and policy can be done at this space, thinking about the funding models that are required, the amount of transparency, data access, et cetera. So I think he's just like the perfect Cyber Policy Center person to speak to us today. So please join me in welcoming Nate.
Thank you, Jeff. And it's a real thrill to be in a room of people who I know are thinking, yes, about the science and also about the impact in people's lives and how we organize as societies, through government, through companies, through other means, to actually make a difference. And that's really what I'm here to talk about today. I want to start with this quote from John Dewey's The Public and Its Problems, which haunts and inspires me. He was writing about the challenges of technology and democracy in 1927, just 2 years before man-made ecological disaster sent over 300,000 American climate refugees to California during the Great Depression, and just 6 years before Leni Riefenstahl made her first film for Hitler. As a scientist, my question today is, can we make the impacts of platforms and AI reliably less accidental and more directed towards the common good? And I am especially grateful, as I said, to be doing it here with people who are leaders in the science and also in the important forms of knowledge making that aren't science, that are equally important in terms of monitoring, understanding, building professional expertise. And so as I talk about this idea of science, I thought I would make that the center of my conversation today. I want to invite you to bring your best ideas and most powerful critiques, not to some tired battleground of epistemologies or status debates, but to a hard question that actually matters to people's lives. Now, I'm sure you've heard so many people open talks on technology with some shocking story of harm towards people. But I want to start with two stories of human excellence and also the role of platforms and AI to bring that down, or at least try to. This is Jennifer Lawrence, multiple Academy Award winner and one of the greatest actresses of our time. In 2014, her intimate photos were stolen and circulated by search engines like Google and on the social platform Reddit. And as people clicked and upvoted these pictures, Reddit's algorithm showed them to even more people, encouraging the algorithm further. And when asked about the experience, Lawrence told Vanity Fair, "It just makes me feel like a piece of meat that's passed around for a profit." And indeed, Reddit made enough money that month, or from donations of appreciation, that they were able to fuel their servers for a month. 10 years later, this kind of experience remains common and is growing. Just this year, presidential candidate Nikki Haley faced a flood of threats from people in her own party who circulated crude and hateful messages about her on the basis of her identity as a woman and an Indian American, rather than her expertise or policies. And of course, it's not just politicians or actresses. As of 2020, 1 in 4 American adults has experienced the most severe forms of online harassment. Among teens, 17% have received explicit images they didn't ask for. 10% have faced physical threats online, and 7% of teens, that's 1.5 million teenagers in America, have had explicit images about them shared without their consent. Encounters that often come from people who they know, who already have ready physical access to them. These are things that are only accelerating with the role of generative AI. And this idea of using violence to keep people in their place didn't start with online platforms or AI, but technologies do appear to be learning hateful patterns from humans. Here's a really fascinating study by Alexandra Ehrman and colleagues that I cited in that Nature article Jeff mentioned, showing that across 6 different search engines, different languages, different engineering teams, different tech stacks, different regulatory environments, all of them, on average, propagated stereotypical prejudices about migrants that are associated with discrimination and violence towards outgroups. So we have these patterns in society that seem to be getting picked up by our technical systems. And so my big question is, could things have been different? Can things be different? Are there things we can do that can reliably support human flourishing and reduce these harms? And one way to ask that is science on these things possible? Can we know things, going back to high school science class, that would repeatably, reliably help? And that might sound basic, but it's actually a cutting edge and challenging question that I know many of you have wrestled with. In 2021, a group of computer scientists observed that they can't provide guidance on how to reliably make a machine learning system more fair over time. It might become more unfair over time. It might become more fair depending on how people respond to the system. And on misinformation, a group of 17 social and computer scientists claimed in 2021 that science doesn't have access to a theory-driven, empirically verified body of literature to answer questions about the effects of algorithms on society. And I would add the effects of society on algorithms as well. And sorry to keep piling on the discouragement, but even worse, what evidence we do have is mostly about wealthy Western societies, as pointed out by Dr. Sakshi Ghai and others in a recent review article about well-being and young people. In the absence of reliable digital governance in the majority world, we have seen these ongoing and recurring instances of technology-involved genocide, election violence, sex trafficking, and other extreme harms. It's been challenging to marshal the resources and the scientific efforts to better understand what's happening in the majority of the world. And so what have we done without this science? I hope this is a fair oversimplification. It is an oversimplification. But wherever we lack reliable ways to prevent and reduce harms, we're left with content moderation, right? This monitor and respond with all of the errors and restrictions of civil liberties that it entails. This is really important work. There are important professions that are coming together around this work. But I think even if you ask those people, they would much rather live in a world where there's less of a need for what they do. And even in content moderation, there can be this cycle of perpetual reinvention of basic lessons and protections, with new products coming out that start out needlessly unsafe, and even with experienced platforms struggling to retain best practices that they've built up over the years. As Mike Masnick pointed out in this quasi-satirical letter, "Hey Elon, let me help you speedrun the content moderation learning curve." Now, this is normally where, as a scientist, I would give you the unified theory that would solve everyone's problems. And I talk a little bit about how we could get to some of that in the Nature article that I shared in advance. But since this is a policy center, I'm going to think about how institutions and organizations and how we can organize ourselves towards this science. What we can do about the barriers that make this challenging, whatever the answers end up being. In 1942, the sociologist Robert Merton described the norms that he thought made science and democracy work well together. Now, many scholars have further developed and critiqued these ideas, but I'm going to use them as kind of signposts to take you on a journey through my own scholarly work that I hope helps inspire yours and helps you think about different policy ideas. Merton, the story goes, argued that science needs to be communal. It's knowledge for everyone. It needs to be disinterested, a pursuit of truth even when inconvenient. Universal, in some way repeatable and usable by many. And moves forward through organized skepticism, basically trust but verify. So I'm going to walk you through this. But first, I want to tell you a little bit more about the lab where I do work at Cornell. The Citizens at Technology Lab is a community and citizen science lab that works with communities of millions of people on research about our digital environments, independently from the tech industry. We believe that research about our digital worlds can achieve for the internet and our communications what community science has accomplished for our planet's biodiversity, our air, our water, food and drug safety, and other issues for the common good. And our ideal research project tries to do at least 2 out of these 3 things: answers a practical question the public is asking, advances scientific theory, and then also contributes in some way to policy. We don't always get all of those things done, but that's what we try for. And along the way, we've been able to publish papers in a range of scholarly venues across computer science and AI and HCI, communication, social psychology, with collaborations in science and technology studies and the law. And our typical cycle of research starts in conversations with communities about what they care about. That prompts engagement with scientific theory. We often collect data and do statistical models, which then leads to field experiments where we test ideas for change and then take that back to communities to figure out how that makes sense to contribute back to science. And that tends to be supported by novel research software that we create. So I hope that's helpful context for then thinking about these different concepts in relation to some of the studies we've done over the years. So let's start with these ideas of communalism and disinterestedness. This represents the idea of science as a public good, a collaboration of humanity across the generations that depend on open knowledge. And in a moment where people think about AI research in terms of what is coming out on arXiv next week or as we talk, it's helpful to remember that science advances over time, and we're allowed to think at that scale. According to Merton, science also needs to be disinterested. This doesn't mean that we can't have a point of view or care about the outcome. It's the point that public knowledge struggles to flourish, where competition for money or prestige create incentives for ignorance and fraud, which is one of the things Merton was particularly concerned about. And so how has this played out in our research? Back in 2014, there was this movement called Gamergate, which was organizing to push women out of gaming and journalism with slurs and threats. Here are some of the examples of the public messages that people sent to game critic and journalist Anita Sarkeesian on Twitter. And this kind of experience is still very common online. It's the kind of thing that was mobilized against Nikki Haley this year, for example. And at the time, companies like Twitter provided methods to report harassment, but were less than transparent about what happened next. So this nonprofit organization, Women Action in Media, was seeking to contribute to public knowledge about harassment protections. And so they organized hundreds of women to record information about the harassment they faced, report it to Twitter, and then also record what the company did in response. They then asked me to lead a research team to study this archive that they created together. So when our findings came out, we were able to study how the company responded to different kinds of reports of harassment. And unfortunately, at the time, the company actually, despite asking for the study, they refused to meet with us. They decided that it was something that they didn't want to know, after all. At the time, the other thing that happened is that some of the very people who were organizing this harassment put our team on a hit list of people to investigate and threaten. And so it felt like a quite discouraging moment where we were worried about our personal safety and we felt like our research might not be listened to. But the good news is that because we were working independently from industry and didn't have any legal or financial constraints forcing us to bury the information, we were still able to publish the results and contribute to public knowledge. Now, my experience with Twitter gave me a personal encounter with the first barrier to science, that even as there are lots of really amazing and committed people within companies, organizations have strong incentives to keep discoveries private, to bury inconvenient truths, and on occasion even attack science, as Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway have written about in other industries. To better understand this dynamic that researchers face, Cat Lab, led by Sarah Gilbert, Flor Fears, and I actually have interviewed over a dozen people doing public interest research outside of academia. And in a study published just last month, we found a similar pattern, that when research matters in ways that are inconvenient to companies or governments, researchers can face risks or threats and also face accusations that our work violates privacy or is unethical in different ways. So in 2021, a group of us decided that we needed to organize people to support researchers doing independent work when they face these risks and threats. We realized that independent research is growing, and also as it has more value, it's facing more threats. And so we co-founded the Coalition for Independent Technology Research, which I know a number of you in this room are members of, which stands together to advance, defend, and sustain the right to ethically study the impact of technology in society. We now have over 300 individual and institutional members, including many of you. And this January, we hired Brandy Gerkink to serve as our executive director. She's there on the top left. We're here to have each other's backs, nurture the growing ecosystem, and fight for a common good that's a basic part of any working democracy. That work is already having a positive impact in courts as we've done research and filed amicus briefs, in parliaments and policy circles as we've submitted research to policy processes, and actually helped save and support the work of hundreds of researchers as they faced API and other data shutdowns. So I would invite you to join the coalition, and I'm happy to field questions about it in the Q&A as useful. So to sum up, science needs to be public and it needs to be disinterested. There are other important forms of research that we absolutely need, but these fundamentals of science are also worth fighting for. After my experience with Twitter in 2014, I decided I would prioritize industry-independent research that collaborated with affected communities, and that made sense for me to take on the questions that wouldn't be asked by people inside of industry. And that became the seed of Cat Lab, and also an important inspiration for my work on the coalition. So let's talk about this idea of generalizability, which has been deeply contested and is hard to reckon with. In 2021, the American Psychological Association published an extraordinary document, an apology to people of color for the organization's role in perpetuating racism, racial discrimination, and human hierarchy. For decades, psychologists, at least some psychologists, had pursued universal ideas of intelligence that reinforced the idea that indigenous people, like me, for example, are naturally less capable and intelligent than Westerners. Regardless of the social or political implications, it turned out to be bad science for a reason that Merton writes about. Science is a search for repeatable knowledge that works, to some degree, can work more than once in more than one context, and that we validate science through replication. And scientific racism couldn't do that. And there are many barriers, systematic and structural barriers, to producing truly generalizable knowledge in the social sciences. But one of them is this problem of exclusion and disparities in science itself. Some of the most vulnerable communities are the same ones who've been systematically excluded and unincluded in the endeavor of science, as Dr. Guy wrote recently. And this is a topic I've done some large-scale analysis on with an article in Nature Human Behavior last year, showing that university faculty in the US aren't actually becoming more diverse in respect to changes in the population on average, despite claims by university PR offices and opponents to diversity who fear this. Take, for example, Dr. Sophia Noble, whose dissertation and book, Algorithms of Oppression, has transformed how computer scientists think about algorithmic bias. When she graduated in the early 2010s, she was one of only 7 Black PhDs in information science that year. And in the subsequent decade, despite a lot of celebration and work on DEI and STEM, the rate of Black PhDs in information science did not increase. So people say we're making progress, we're not really accomplishing that. And so what do you do in a situation where you need to improve the generalizability of knowledge, but science itself is struggling to keep up with the needs and scale of humanity? Well, there are things you can do in research methods. In a recent computer science paper with Eric Pennington and Zenobia Chan, we developed a system for N-of-1 trials. Right? If scientists have constraints of who we know and who we reach out to, well, what happens if we enable anyone to do randomized trials in their own lives? We were taking on this question that the anti-eugenics statistician Lancelot Hogben called in the 1930s the tyranny of averages. That if you're looking at a particular problem or question in society, and maybe on average, a technology or an issue doesn't have that much of an impact, some people benefit dramatically, other people face extreme harms, you might compute an average and think there's no effect, but miss these harms on the extremes. There's been researchers like Andrew Shubilsky and others who've written about this as well. And so we organized people to do a set of randomized trials in their own lives. And in this particular study, we found that some of these conversations about well-being and technology use had failed to incorporate an understanding of the experiences of people with vision impairment and colorblindness who chose to sign up for our study in larger numbers and who we might have not observed if we'd done one of these large kind of population average studies. I'll share another example that's kind of more internationally and globally relevant. So when Wikipedia created a feature for thanking people for their contributions to knowledge, they wanted to encourage a welcoming culture and also find a way to encourage contributors to continue to contribute to this public good. And they were wondering, can thanking others achieve this? And we were curious about studying this question with Wikipedians. And so we ended up organizing a study with Wikipedians in Persian, Arabic, Polish, and German language Wikipedias. So we convened leaders from these different language movements and co-designed a series of parallel replications. So they had to negotiate with each other around the details of a field experiment that would be simultaneously carried out in these 4 different language groups in very different social and political environments at the same time. I won't have a chance to go into the details of the study, which is currently in prep, but we found when we were able to kind of collectively meta-analyze these multiple community experiments with different populations and different cohorts, that this organizing, thanking endeavor did increase the retention of Wikipedians. And even more importantly, it actually, on average, had this effect of increasing the rate at which thanks recipients went on to thank others. So it wasn't just having this immediate effect, but it may have one of these kind of recursive effects that people talk about in social psychology, where you receive an intervention and then it has these cascading, ongoing impacts across a network of people. And this was something we were able to do because we worked with communities. We did explicit outreach to communities outside of your typical like Western English language Wikipedia context. And we built software that enabled us to do these parallel replications in different languages. So as we think about what we can do to overcome these barriers to generalizable knowledge, we can collaborate with affected communities, and we can support research at the margins. And one of the things that's been especially rewarding about this work has been to see how many of our community partners and leaders have gone on to careers in science or other forms of leadership. In fact, this is a photo of our very first community research summit as Cat Lab was being formed. And one of the leaders at that meeting, Jasmine Walker, is currently a fellow at the Stanford Digital Civil Society Lab. So it's been really cool to see her journey from, like very active leader as a moderator of Reddit to someone who's speaking more broadly to broader policy and societal questions on content moderation. So the final one is organized skepticism. This is a painting from 1768 an experiment on a bird in an air pump by Joseph Wright. And it illustrates this final Mertonian norm. The idea that we trust and verify by trying to replicate our findings. This is a country scientist testing Robert Boyle's experiment with an air pump that was illustrated in the Royal Society. And the idea here is that most important knowledge in digital conversation or digital governance, it isn't science, it's okay. That's essential practice work and capabilities that people build up in their professions. But there is value to finding things that are reliably useful in multiple contexts. And to get there, we need to actually verify that things work. So many of the studies in our conversations about digital governance are a single study in a single place and a single time. And back in the era of the founding of the Royal Society, they realized that if you wanted to actually confirm that something worked, you would have to try it multiple times, maybe in a less dramatic way than asphyxiating a bird in front of shocked children. But there was an idea that actually, in a democracy, it would be important to create open knowledge that anyone could see and scrutinize. And so one of the barriers to this in our space is that replications are hard when each study requires novel software and engineering. I know a lot of you have thought about this problem in particular, and I'll share an example of a study that I initially did a few years ago, which has then had ongoing replications in interesting ways. So I started to ask this generalizability question in 2016 when doing a field experiment with a group of over 1,000 community moderators about preventing online harassment in online conversations. We knew that human behavior is guided by our perceptions about what's common or acceptable to others. This conversation in social psychology about social norms, and that these come from different places. And we also had this open policy question, right? Do policies against harassment stifle, or do they broaden speech rights? You can imagine a world in which people find out that certain things are unacceptable, and then they are more quiet. Right? You have this self-censoring effect. Or you could imagine a context where if people know that they're less likely to face harassment, they're more likely to speak up. There's a debate in the law and policy space about the impact of harassment policies on freedom of expression. So we designed an intervention. We used software with this community to randomly assign conversations to receive information about social norms, naming the behavior, the consequences, and showing that the norms had legitimacy in the community. And in this study that I published in PNAS in 2019, I found that there wasn't a trade-off between anti-harassment policies and freedom of expression. Displaying clear policies against harassment could, in this community, prevent thousands of first-time commenters per month from unruly behavior, and also increase first-time commenters on scientific discussions by tens of thousands of people per month on average. But that was just one study. And when communities and other folk came to me and said, so should we do this? My answer was, don't take my word for it, right? Instead, use the software we've created to conduct a replication. Right? We want to know, is this just one thing in one community at one moment in time? And so over the next 4 years, we worked with a bunch of communities to replicate this initial study in 4 different contexts, amounting to a total of more than 250,000 participants. And in a study in PrEP, we found that the original findings held. There's variation, and sometimes you have a larger effect or a smaller effect, or it's unclear whether there's an effect at all. But you start to build that together into a meta-analysis, and you can get a better estimate, both of the overall effect and the circumstances in which something is more likely to be effective. And we similarly found the same to be the case in this question about whether it deters people's speech. There's variation, but on average, you do see that in the worst case, it doesn't decrease participation, even when you have policies against harassment. And so by replicating studies, communities could confirm whether an intervention was actually helping in their context or not. They could read a study, say, could this work here? We would say, maybe, why don't you test it? they could use our software to test it and then make a decision about what to do. This is actually an idea with a long history in the social sciences. Donald Campbell, who wrote one of the classic books on causal inference, had this idea of contagious cross-validation, that you, like, instead of just reading a study and doing a thing, you read a study and test it, and you find out if it works, and you build science through that way as well. And so the study, the findings in the study have been adopted by a variety of platforms, a variety of communities. They've shaped a policy in really interesting ways, as I've watched governments cite this research, both to draw attention to the issue and inform a conversation about prevention, and to support calls for more research. In fact, just this spring, US-EU trade negotiation pointed to research like this as a reason for supporting platform transparency and other kinds of data sharing that would make this kind of research more possible. And then, there's a contribution to science. There's this multi-generational discussion about social norms that we added our small piece to. It inspired further replications and extensions. And I think it's also done a little bit of work to inspire the methods that people use. And we were able to do these replications because we'd taken the time to invest in high quality software engineering that made it possible for a new community to say, sure, we will invite your software into our context. We will do a replication of this study. And we still get requests to do replications of studies that we did years ago. And by having software that can do that, we've driven down the cost of those replications so that it's more viable, definitely compared to another lab building their own software stack and reimagining how these studies go. And so this is another way potentially to overcome barriers, and I'd love to see more collaboration across science on infrastructure so that we can replicate each other's studies more effectively. So, I want to come back to this question, how could we go from this world where we put things in the world, where the idea of testing something is the kind of hold my beer theory of products and their role in society, where we're less worried, like Dewey was, about the harm or good being a matter of accident, but we actually can leverage science for improving our digital environments. And I think one piece is this disinterested knowledge. We need to support independent research, collaborate with communities, protect researchers when they face threats. That's an unfortunate fact of this kind of work. Support generalizable knowledge, especially supporting research at the margins. Our approach is community science. There are many other ways to do that. And then think about organized skepticism, empowering the public to do replication and create research infrastructures. In the last couple of minutes, and I know we want to have a rich dialogue, I'm going to just give a hint about some stuff that is coming up that I would love to brainstorm with people. There is this article in Nature about developing the science of human algorithm feedback. And to give you an illustration of why that's so tricky, I mentioned the story of Jennifer Lawrence at the beginning. And you have this situation where she's like a person caught up in a cycle of things, right? We live in a society that already has misogyny, where there are businesses that benefit from it. I was reading just this week about the role of betting in the harassment of sports figures, right? Where people have a lot of money riding on the performance of athletes in various sports things, and so they send them targeted threats in order to try to throw matches. And that's something that's bigger than any particular digital technology. So we have these forces at play in society. We have individual psychology and behavior when you encounter something sexist or racist or lurid of this kind. That builds up into collective behavior. It is entangled with algorithm design and the design of the user experiences. So there are many moving parts here that all feed into each other that we need to better understand. And so I've been trying to think of, like, what are some analogies that can help us organize as scientists? And one I've been thinking about is from ecology. It's this idea of eutrophication, right? In the study of waterways, adding more nutrients into the water is not always good, right? You need enough nutrients that life can flourish. But if you have too many nutrients, it can lead to these algal blooms, which generate toxins, and the next thing you know, you actually crashed the oxygen in the system, and all the fish are dead. And so you have these like complex systems of interactions between forces, and we've been thinking about online communities in similar ways. So communities have talked to us about how recommender systems and popularity algorithms are kind of like a storm that sends pollution runoff into a stream. It's too much nutrients, too much attention, and it creates dynamics that are beyond a community's capacity to handle, right? You have volunteer moderators, you have AI moderation, but you get this massive influx. And in fact, many communities on Reddit have this practice of just shutting down their conversations in order to weather these influxes of what ordinarily would be quite good, like new people joining the community and so forth. The art on the left is some work by Ed Platt to visualize what a conversation before and after it gets algorithmically amplified. The darker brown branches are before something gets amplified by Reddit's algorithms, and those green shoots are what happens when you get all sorts of recommender systems sending people into a conversation. And we've been talking with communities about like pruning and ecological management as analogies. So how have people managed this in our physical environments? Well, there's a really cool project here in California that is a collaboration between the forecasting work of citizen scientists and government and agricultural policy. So this is Birdcast, a project at Cornell which collects observations from people all around the world about birds. And people observe birds, they record them in an app, and it gives them information about samples of where birds are at a given time. And the Lab of O uses this to create a bird migration forecast, because it's really hard to predict where an individual bird is going to be at any given time. That's just a very complex system. But if you look at overall migration patterns, and you can't necessarily say this species of birds will be traveling through the Central Valley next year at this time. But if you have bird watchers in different places, you can say, well, we think they're going to come through next week, or they're going to come through next month. And one of the things that California has been working on has been working on this problem of birds not having enough resources to actually make it through their migration. With all the farming, there isn't enough water for birds to actually drink and make it through California. And it's not a great thing for policy to just end a bunch of farms. So what they've done is they've created financial incentives for farmers to flood their fields at certain times in ways that are informed by the forecasts that allow them to adjust the economic model of farming so that farmers continue to farm and birds survive and make it through their migrations. And so we've been talking with communities about what are ways that forecasting, which is another one of these tools of science, can be helpful for managing these influxes of harassment. So we've done some work with a large subreddit and indeed found in some modeling that when your conversation is promoted by Reddit's algorithms on the site, you get more newcomers and you get more harassment. And so we've done some modeling on that. And we are currently doing the data analysis on a field experiment where we monitored Reddit's algorithms. We tried to anticipate when we would see greater amounts of harassment. And then we deployed with the community different harassment reduction measures, kind of like this program in the Central Valley, so that they would be in place when they would be most helpful to keep the community safe. I don't have any results from this. I literally got the data frames back yesterday, but it's an example of an idea that came from community members and could be really valuable for science. And in fact, one of the things that I've been thinking about as a potential collective scientific endeavor, as Cat Lab has been monitoring a lot of these recommender systems for years and have historical data going far back, and I know a bunch of you probably have some of that kind of data as well, has been to develop some kind of forecasting challenge that would allow us to better understand these like human algorithm behavior dynamics. And even if we can't necessarily say what is going to make this particular, say, piece of COVID misinformation prominent on this particular day, it might help us understand these broader kind of 1,000-foot patterns. Like, what are the factors that make misogyny or violence or a certain kind of misinformation in general more prominent? And how can we get an early warning of those things so that even if we can't tell you about an individual thing, we can start to characterize overall how these things spread. And importantly, going back to that study by Alexander Ehrman that I mentioned, to what degree are the designs of these algorithms actually shaping these patterns, or are there deeper dynamics at play that we need to look to in terms of human behavior and tendencies? So this is a very kind of early stage thing that I'm still starting to think through, and I'd love to take the conversation further. And more generally, just invite and call on everyone to ask this question about how we can look for usable science, even though we know it's really hard to do well and create that kind of repeatable, reusable knowledge. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nate. Really amazing in terms of ability to scale from really rigorous research all the way up to policy ideas, then to work that can support the science. Let me just start out by asking you a general question, which is there policy right now out there that you're excited about? And if not a specific piece, is there anything like some properties of things that you're hoping to see come out soon?
We could have a whole conversation about that. I think there are a couple of categories of policy that I'm thinking a lot about right now. One category has to do with policies relating to like data access and transparency. And we've had some in the EU with the Digital Services Act, which is now starting to be used. And we've also seen some laws in the United States as well. There's a new paper we just published that looks at New York's employment algorithm transparency policy, where New York City is requiring companies that, employers that use hiring algorithms to get a third-party bias audit and actually publish those results. And so together with Consumer Reports and Data and Society, we published a study looking at our employers doing that and how that's playing out. And I think those transparency laws are important. I'd say another category I'm thinking about is, it's not necessarily all laws, but it's policy making around like AI safety. And I'm serving on the NIST AI Institute. AI Institute's ASIC, AISIC, AI Safety Institute Consortium. That's what it is. And there's this desire for AI standards, and it's a hard one because like society needs them, and the scientists aren't always able to produce that at the pace that people need, and so it can be heartbreaking as well. Yep. I'd say the third area has to do with policy work and litigation that is impacting the kind of financial picture, right? For all of this to happen, we need research to be funded, and the scale of funding for research is far lower than what we actually need to answer the questions that society has. And so as we look at laws and litigation that is going to create taxes or could have damages for various things, it's going to be important to ask how can we advise key actors in such a way that the resources are made available for the kind of knowledge society needs.
Yeah, I know we were talking about that with Ross earlier, I know, and I was thinking a little bit about some conversation I was having earlier with some funders that were talking about the percent of profit for, say, platforms, and as a proportion, the amount of funding on research to examine those platforms is like so far apart, especially relative to other technologies. Oh, great. The forecasting work that you were talking about at the end there is really intriguing. I think a lot of times policymakers are like, yeah, great, thanks for showing us your research, but what do we know about the future? So what are some kind of suggestions or trends that make you think you could be successful in that? I was thinking about a recent paper that Angela sent me in Nature showing that, you know, human interaction patterns are really consistent across platforms and over the last 20 years, like longer forums have more toxicity, for example. So do you feel like there's enough, you know, humanness in the system, the human AI system, that you could say, yeah, there's going to be these knowable, forecastable patterns that we could then utilize to, you know, get in front of them, prevent the too many nutrients getting into the creek?
I'm really interested to find out, is my first answer. But I think there are some reasons to think it might be the case at different timescales and different scales. So, and the stakes are hard. Like it could be, we could be better off either way, right? There's this piece by Sendhil Mullainathan, which some of you might have read, where he argues that human behavior is really consistent, and so we should be hoping that technology systems are easier to change. Like I think the article title is "Biased Systems Are Easier to Fix Than Biased People," and if you look at something like employment discrimination, it's very persistent. It's been hard to change despite lots of policy work. And it would be great to live in a world where you could just tweak a few things about an algorithm and you've solved housing discrimination. And so I think on some of these really persistent issues, there's a paper by a bunch of authors, including Suresh Venkata-Subramanian and others, about very long-term patterns on these feedback loops, a multi-decade analysis. And they are hopeful that these things are persistent, but kind of pessimistic because it also means that these social challenges might be harder to solve than we think.
Right. Yeah. Dana Boyd has often talked about like we can't use tech to solve all of humans' toxic behaviors. Yeah. Great. All right. Well, let's open it up to the room. Is there anybody with questions here? We'll start Ryan over there, and then over here.
Thanks for the really inspiring presentation. One thing that came up in a couple of times throughout your talk was the idea of average effects or experiences versus deeply individual effects or experiences. And that's actually a theme I'm going to synthesize across CPC events, but that's actually a theme that's come up in many speakers this year, including Andrew Shabilsky and Patty Valkenberg, these ideas. And I guess my question is, how should we optimize our work? Should we optimize to understand averages? Should we optimize to best understand individuals? And when we think about designing work and communicating that work, like which aspects should we emphasize? What are the inputs that go into thinking about those distinctions? Do we emphasize both? I would just love to hear you think a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll share a context I've been thinking about lately. So in January, we collaborated with the Knight First Amendment Institute on a workshop about bridging the gap between like computational research and the law. One of the things that I'm sure people in this series have wrestled with is that, you know, we have a bunch of lawsuits. We have regulators that want to use evidence in meaningful ways in respect to the tech industry, but the way the law works, the way that regulators think, isn't necessarily the same as how researchers think. we held this workshop, and one of the challenges, I think, is that researchers don't hear enough at an early stage about the epistemologies of the policy contexts where our research could be impactful. And similarly, people in law and policy don't always know what good research looks like, or even know that they can talk to a scientist before putting together some large investigation or lawsuit. And so one of the things I've been working on, and I have some papers in prep, has been to bridge that understanding so that those of us who are doing science can bring higher quality science into these conversations in a way that doesn't feel like it has to be shoehorned into courts or into the policy process.
Great, thank you. Oh, over here.
Thank you. I think this is related. Something that I really admire about your work is how centered on communities and kind of grassroots organizing your work is, but at the same time, we have these needs about how policy is affected. So the Federal Trade Commission, I think yesterday, put out a list of research questions. Is that normatively a good thing, or does that kind of undermine community-centered work?
I haven't looked at their questions yet, though I saw that they came out. I think questions are going to come from multiple places. At Cat Lab, we often and always and regularly argue that if you are going to be agenda setting, you need to include affected communities. Last year, I spent the year here in the Bay Area at Casbus, and at the end of the trip, I went on a bicycle ride through the Central Valley. And on that trip, I met with people in Kern County who live in the shadow of leaking abandoned oil wells. And it can be really hard if you and your kids are getting sick from the fumes of an industry that is leaving, that was the hot thing a century ago, to be able to get heard and have some kind of remediation and support. And there aren't necessarily massive teams of scientists descending on Kern County to do this work, and many people are hours drive away from the nearest university because there's just been underinvestment in certain parts of the state. And so in those contexts, citizen science is really important. Meeting people from climate citizen science groups and environmental justice groups who are bringing scientific instruments, collecting data, organizing communities. And in one case, a community in Kern County collected data, proposed local laws, and those laws ended up being adopted by the whole state of California because people who are affected are often policy entrepreneurs in their own right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great.
Hello, thank you for your talk. So I have very general question. So I kind of also agree that the algorithms can definitely shape our human behavior, but the point is most of these algorithms is designed and it's kind of accessible by big tech companies. But how, as a scientist, how we can actually convince them or creating some laws that they let us to access the data, and then we can do some better research, because those algorithms in daily life of the people, whatever experiment that we design is kind of very limited, population based, a lot of limitations, but they have access all of that, but we don't have access for example, after Zuckerberg's problems happen, even the Facebooks make a lot of limitations about accessing to the data. So what is your thoughts on that? Because and also kind of even convince them to do some research in their companies, because I believe they are more care about profits, rather than any kind of like social impacts or anything like that. So yeah, it's general thought.
Oh, another conversation we could have, a days-long discussion of. First, I want to say there are really amazing researchers inside of companies who care about these topics and do this research. Maybe not as much as they would like to. Sometimes they're not allowed to share their results. But there is good research happening inside of companies. And similarly, there's good research that's happening when academics and other groups are able to find a way to negotiate collaborations with companies. My work is mostly focused on entirely independent work, and I think there are a few things that we are doing and can do better. Groups like the Coalition are standing up for researchers when there are threats of APIs being shut down, crowdsourcing ideas and collaborating on ideas to create alternative data access approaches, and even defending researchers in court. I think we're also feeding policymakers information about the facts of how companies are treating researchers, some good, some bad, some ugly, so that policymakers can make wise decisions when deciding what kinds of things to compel companies to do. And I think there's also a really important role for researchers to work with litigators. Like when you have these large lawsuits, you have a discovery phase, which means that courts can compel companies to release certain kinds of information. And we as a scientific community have an opportunity to communicate to courts what kind of information would be useful to answer the questions, whatever the answer is, right? Because we're committed to as far as we can, to the truth of the science wherever it takes us. And using those court-mandated data releases or information releases is another tool for generating public knowledge.
Great. We have one over here.
Thank you very much for the talk. You mentioned AI transparency, and I want to touch on the related question of interpretability. There's been a great deal of work right now, and the field is actually very, moving very fast in terms of mechanistic interpretability. And I'm wondering how so meaning the mapping of semantics on specific parts of a neural network to sort of disentangle, the causal, if you want to call it causal, or the explanation for what's going on in the network. Are you optimistic for this type of very technical research to have meaningful dialogue with the types of explanations that make sense to everyday citizens, types of causal explanations that everyone wants to hear when they've been denied housing, for example? And what's the state of the dialogue in that field?
Yeah, I think this actually relates to this question about how well can we understand algorithm behavior at a macro level? Because it forces us to ask, how important is it to know how the thing works under the hood, right? The assumption is that in order for us to better understand and manage these things, we need to understand the intimate details of how they work. And that might be true, but it might not be. There's like a classic paper by Kempton called Two Theories of Home Heat Control. I don't know if you know this one, Jeff.
The paper.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that they looked at how people think thermostats work, right? And there's a very particular set of technical explanations for how thermostats work. And they found that people really don't understand how thermostats work, but they could still use thermostats just fine, because even though they misunderstood the underlying mechanisms, they had a sense of the behavior of the system and how the things they could do could influence that behavior. And if we live in the world described by Ehrman and colleagues, where 10 different designs of a machine learning system, 10 different teams actually kind of behave the same way when you put them in touch with humans, then explainability and interpretability get us partway towards managing those problems when we try to figure out how to change the system, but they might do less for us when it comes to actually addressing the issues. If like you can implement it 10 different ways and it still generates a particular good outcome or harm. And so I think that's one unanswered question I'm really curious about.
Yeah, I love that point because like most of your work, it centers people and their goals. Like those outcomes you talk about is like, what is the person trying to accomplish? And whether it was with one model versus another, if the person's able to accomplish it in a way that satisfies their needs, then that can be valuable right there. Yeah, so I agree. Well, let's end it there. Please join me in thanking Nate for this really comprehensive talk. Thank you so much, Nate. Really appreciate it. And please join us next week when Nate will be hosting David Brookman from UC Berkeley for our last visitor seminar